Today's our final message in our Imagine series. What a great series. Have you guys enjoyed this series? Okay. The 37 of you who've been here, or the 37 of you that chose to clap right there, thank you. It's been an incredible series. I'm not kidding. I've loved this series. I've loved sharing it. I've loved everything about it. I've loved so I'll just give you the highlights of the past month, some of the things that we talked about. This idea of functioning in freedom. Functioning in freedom. I think so often we live our lives and we feel held back by something and we're not always certain what it is, but we're not meant to be held back really by anything. I mean, Jesus came to set us free. It says in Scripture that it was for freedom that He set us free. He didn't set us free so we could walk in bondage. He didn't set us in freedom so we could be held back by something. He set us free so we could live in freedom. And too often we don't do that. Too often we're held back by things. Too often we're held back even by things, even by our imagination, and by like, well, we can't do that. Well, why not? Well, why not? Sometimes I think if we just think, well, if I could do it, then I would do it, and why don't we do it? Why don't we just do what God has encouraged us or told us or let us know that we're available, that what's available to us? And freedom is one of those things. He set us free not to walk as slaves, but to walk as sons and daughters. The next week we talked about this idea of a fully funded life. A fully funded life. We talked about, it was interesting because in that message, I said something that was, it's kind of resonated with me since then, because everything, like when I'm up here, sometimes the things I say are scripted, and sometimes the things I say are spontaneous. And I said something that was, sometimes you live between scarcity and stewardship. And sometimes it's clear, well, it's not enough, we don't have enough. We're like, hey, you know what, it's just not the time. And I think some of these times, for us, you might live in a place where you're like, well, it's never enough. Well, then it's scarcity. Because God isn't a God of never enough. God is a God of, you'll have everything you need according to my riches and glory. That's what our God says. And so if you ever find yourself living in never enough, you have to realize, okay, that's not right. That's not the right mindset. It might be, well, it's not the right time. And that's the stewardship mindset. But I encourage you with this. And here's the golden thread for all of it. When you honor God with what you have, when you honor God with what you have and what you have coming in, that is the key to unlocking a fully funded life. Just honoring God. Honor opens doors. And I told you the story about how River Valley, I was able to the relationship that we have with River Valley Church, it's incredible. Just how honor opened that door. And yesterday I get a text from Darren Poley. If you remember the story, he's the one that I interned with. I almost quit the internship. 20 years later, he texts me and says, hey, are you sitting down? River Valley Church is going to give you $50,000 towards your church. Amazing, right? So yesterday he calls me and he says, hey, where are you right now? I'm like, I'm at home. And he goes, I'm right by your church. I want a tour. So we walked around here yesterday, and I showed him the place. He's like, this is unbelievable. He was blown away. He's like, this place is incredible. He goes, where'd you get those chairs? I said, from River Valley. He goes, we bought those chairs. I was like, hey, thank you. It's amazing favor and how honor opens doors to what God can do. And so the final thing was an unfazed faith. We talked about that last week. I gave the analogy, I told the story about we were at the lake and we're on a pontoon and we had our floaties and all these things and we're tied off to the dock and it just kind of hit me like, imagine if you just lived life tied off to the dock. Like you're still in the boat, right? You can still take selfies and it looks like you're out on the lake and loving life, but you're really still attached to the shore. But what if God has more? What if He has more for us than just being attached to the dock and just imagining 3 feet of water and like, oh, this is great, this is wonderful, this is what life is. But He has so much more for us. And it's our faith, it's stepping out in faith that will get us there. So it's been an incredible month. So that's the recap. If you weren't here, now you know. Today we're going to close out our entire series by imagining this, the fun of favor. The fun of favor. Now, when we planned this series, this was the one we got. We don't really talk about favor too often here at Canvas, even though we are highly favored by God. It's incredible when you think about it. I think sometimes you walk through life, you're like, oh, that was cool, and that was cool, and that was cool. But then you realize, like, you know what, I just have to step back and realize how favored we are of God. When I was in Alabama in April and I was doing my 100-hour SEAL fit type craziness that I did, the pastor's wife, my good friend, his wife said, Jeff, you don't understand how favored you are and how favored your church is. I was like, I don't, help me. What do you mean? She said, no one does a capital campaign, hopes to raise $300,000 and raises almost 400. She's like, no one does that. Like, that's the favor of God on your life and on your church. I was kind of blown away by it, right? And so as we talk about this idea of favor, I thought, what a fun way to finish this series. And so when you hear the word favor, you might be thinking, I wonder what exactly that means. So I have some definitions here, and here they are. Overgenerous, preferential treatment. That's one. An act of kindness beyond what is due or usual. To feel or show approval or preference for. To give unfair preferential treatment to. That's what favor is. So you think about this. Overgenerous, preferential, kindness beyond what's normal, unfair preferential treatment. That's what fair is. And it's interesting because as I read that, it seemed like the author that was writing it, it seemed like they weren't on the receiving end of favor. I mean, sometimes when you read something and you notice they're kind of snarky about it, I was like, wow, they're clearly not feeling the favor, because when you're on the receiving end of favor, guess what it is? It's fun. Right? Like, favor is fun when you're on the receiving end of it. Here's an example. So our son, Bo, he's 3.5. Bo is infamous with so many things. This kid, I don't even know. Some of the things he does, I don't really understand where he comes up with them. One day, about 6 weeks ago, we're sitting on our front porch, and Bo walks up, and he's got a popsicle in his hand. And I'm like, where did you get a popsicle? Like, I didn't know we had any. He's like, Nick's. I'm like, Nick's our neighbor. Right? I'm like, you got it from Nick? Yeah, Nick. I'm like, okay. And I was looking, and there was no cars in Nick's driveway. And I'm like, is Nick home right now? No. 3 years old. He's a hardened criminal, right? Walked in Nick's house, walked to the freezer, helped himself to a popsicle, turned, walked down, he's tearing the paper in front of us, like he doesn't even care. No shame at all, right? And I was like, oh my goodness. I was like, what is this? And so right away, well, of course I have to call Nick. I have to call my neighbor. I'm like, Nick, I'm so sorry. I explained to him what happened. He's like, oh, that's okay. I'm like, what do you mean that's okay? He's like, that's fine. He does it kind of all the time. I'm like, what? And this is what Nick says. He goes, could you just do me a favor? I was like, yeah, anything. He goes, could you please just walk over to the house and make sure that he closed the freezer door, because sometimes he leaves it open. I'm like, you're not even mad. He goes, no, I'm not mad. Like, that's favor, right? When you can go to the neighbor's house, get popsicles whenever you want to. Like, that is overgenerous, preferential kindness, right? So that's Bo, right? But sometimes, here's the deal. Sometimes with favor, if you're not the one receiving it, sometimes you can get stuck, right? Because you're like, well, that's just not fair. You look at other people and you're like, well, that's not fair what they're experiencing. That's just not fair, right? Have you ever noticed that? And then sometimes I notice this when I'm talking to people about favor. It's almost like when you start talking to people about favor and you give them a green light, what happens is it's like, oh, I can talk to you right now about the cool things, the amazing things God's doing in my life, and you're not going to judge me or think I'm weird. It's the weirdest thing. I'm serious. And so I was talking to my neighbor yesterday, Nick, again, and he's telling me all these incredible things God's doing in his life, and he's like, I didn't want to share them with people because I didn't want to feel like I was bragging. It's incredible. Because sometimes what happens is that, this is happening to you, and you're like, who can I share this with? I'm so excited to share. You're like, well, I'd love to share with them, but they'd get jealous, and I don't know if they'd seem like it's fair. I remember one time, so we're a part of a denomination or fellowship called the Assemblies of God, and the leader of it sent me a text, and he said, hey, this church just hit 1,000 for the first time. I was like, that is incredible. That's so amazing. I love it. And he sent me a follow-up text. He said, I told you because I knew you'd celebrate it. It's amazing sometimes that we won't celebrate the favor upon other people's lives, and then we're like, I wonder why I don't get favor. It's not fair. Okay, there is a correlation between celebration and receiving favor upon your life. There just is. And so I'm talking to Nick about this and this idea of favor, and then sometimes we look at it and we see other people and we're like, well, it's not fair. It's not fair what they're experiencing. It's not fair what they're walking through. I remember when I was at a little restaurant downtown Minneapolis called The Local. I don't know if I ever told that story. I used to serve there before I was a pastor. And I remember my final season there, I was the lead server. And every single party that came in the holiday season, so like between November 1 and January 1, I was the lead server on it. Every single party. And it used to be where they'd split up parties, because here's the thing with parties. It's way less work and it's way more money. Like, it's just like, it is so great. It's the best thing ever. And every Friday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, I'd roll in and it would say party, it'd say Jeff Wendt, Jeff Wendt, Jeff Wendt, every time. And it got to the point where the other servers were like, why do you always get it? Why are you always on this? And I'd say, I don't know, but I did know, right? Because it was favor. It was favor. And they would always follow it up with, well, it's not fair. And they were right. You want to know why? Because favor isn't fair. Favor just isn't fair. It isn't fair. Have you ever met someone that there's so much favor on their life that sometimes it's just not fair? You hear about it, you're like, are you kidding? Like, seriously? So if there's a person in my life who I can say has the greatest amount of favor of anyone I've ever met before, it's my wife. It's my wife, Tiffany. Yeah, right? Yeah. So I get a front row seat to the favor that she receives on a regular basis. And by front row, I literally mean that, because 2 weeks ago we got pulled over and she was driving and I was in the passenger seat, and the police officer comes up and so here, I'll just a little insight. When I get pulled over, I don't give him my driver's license. I give him my credit card, because I just know I'm gonna get a ticket. I'm just like, how much is it gonna cost? Just pay it right here. Let's just be done with it, right? Well, so this officer pulls up and she's really sweet and she goes, ma'am, can I get your license? And Tiffany's like, you know what? It's all the way in the back of the truck. Do you want me to get it? And she's like, no, that's fine. What's your name? She writes her name down. Could I get your insurance card? Here it is, but it's actually, it's expired, but the insurance is still good, but the card is expired. She's like, it's okay. Like, at that point, she probably would have pulled her gun on me. Sir, get out of the car. That's what it would have been, right? So she comes back like 3.5 minutes later. And then like if it's a long time, you're like, oh my gosh, like the tow truck is coming, SWAT's coming, like they're coming to get me, right? 3.5 minutes later, she walks up, she goes, well, ma'am, I just decided to write you a warning. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Then afterwards, I was like, okay, it saved me money, so I didn't have to pay anything. But it was one of those things that was like unbelievable favor. And so that was just one story. Here's some more stories. And these are some stories that I'm just gonna throw out there, and you can choose what to do with them, okay? You can choose to celebrate them, or you can choose to say they're not fair. I'm just a warning, because some of these things, they're so extravagant that I scratch my head at them. I'm like, are you kidding me? So here's one. About 9 months ago, maybe a year ago, a box shows up on our front porch. And I was like, oh, that's nice. And it says Tiffany. And this was at a time where a lot of things were showing up on our front porch for Tiffany, and cards and different things. And she opens the box, and inside the box is a pair of black shoes with red soles. And I'm like, oh, those are nice. Those are cool. She goes, you know what these are? I'm like, they're shoes. She said they're Louis Vuitton shoes. And I was like, great. She said they're $1,200 shoes. And I said, I'm sorry, what? Showed up as a gift. Just Tiffany. Just wanted to show love to you. It's unbelievable, right? Here's some more. So a couple weeks ago, Tiffany's on Instagram. She's in her office, which really, by the way, it looked like a vagabond was living in her office, but it wasn't. It was just boxes and stuff all over the place, right? And she's showing it on Instagram saying, hey, help, someone please help me. Like, I'm trying to organize my office, and I really want a white desk. So if you know anyone who has a white desk, is selling a white desk, or anywhere I can get a white desk, please let me know. 7 minutes later, my phone blows up, and someone says, hey, I just direct messaged Tiffany on Instagram. Make sure she sees it. Okay. It happens sometimes. So I go to Tiffany, I said, hey, so-and-so direct message you on Instagram. And did you see that? Yep. Went and looked at it. So she said, this friend of ours from our previous church said, hey, I want to buy you a desk. I mean, how? Really? Like, buy you a desk? This is amazing. And so a little time goes by, and then Tiffany gets back to her and says, okay, I'm about to buy a desk, looking at them, looked all over the place, just wanted to know, like, what is the budget, right? Because there's desks you can buy for like $100, and there's desks you can buy for like much more. And like instantly, This person texts back, $5,000. Are you kidding me? Like $5,000? I was like, do you know, like, does this person want to do our entire office space or just your office? And so then the person said, hey, you know what? Let's just make this easy. I'll meet you at Southdale. Meet you at Southdale. The Galleria, oh, sorry. The Galleria. I'm so sorry. Just to clarify, the Galleria, right by Southdale. So we're there, right? And so we go to Restoration Hardware, and I'm looking around, I'm like, dear Lord, this is crazy expensive. Then we go to this other place called Pottery Barn, maybe you've heard of it. And so we're inside there, and she's like, I like this, and like, okay, so I think this is the desk. So our friend shows up, and our friend is like, you want that? Timmy's like, okay, we'll take that. And then we need chairs, so let's get 2 custom chairs like this, and here's an office chair, because you need a good office chair, right? They can be up to $2,000. This is what she's saying. So she's like, let's get that. She's like, you need a bookshelf. And Timmy's like, well, I'd like this one. She goes, okay, we'll take 2 of those. And it was like crazy. And by the end of it, like I just sat there. And I was talking to my buddy, and I was like, this is unbelievable. Like, what is the generosity? And like, well, this is something that she really wanted to do. My wife really wanted to do this. And I'm blown away. So we went and sat and had dinner, and I scratched my head. I'm like, I don't understand it. It wasn't like this isn't fair. I was just like, why does God love you the most? This is what she says all the time. All the time. I got more stories. You guys want to hear some more? I'm just saying, and here's the reason. I'll be honest with you. The reason why I think Tiffany is blessed so much and so favored is because she's like, yeah, well, my God, my dad did it. My Father in heaven did it, so why not? Why wouldn't our Father in heaven want to lavish extravagant gifts upon us, right? And so she's like, she just lives that way. So there's other times where literally thousands of dollars of shoes and clothing just show up at our house. I'm like, I don't even understand this. We got a call a couple weeks ago, or like a couple months ago, and a family friend, very close family friend, says, hey, I consider you one of our daughters, so we would like to take you to Disney World with our family in October for a week. I'm like, sweet, we're going to Disney. She's like, no, it's just me. I'm like, what? I'm like, who's going to watch your kids? Favor is not fair, people. It's pretty incredible, right? It's pretty amazing. But I just want to say, of all those things that show the incredible, amazing favor on Tiffany's life, it's that God gave Tiffany me. Why the laughter, right? 2 weeks ago, I'm standing in the lobby, and someone comes up to me and they say, you realize that you totally married up, right? I'm like, is it that clear? I mean, is it that apparent, right? I'm like, anyway, so goodness, it's amazing the favor upon her life. But I'll say this, it's favor unlike anyone I've ever met before, anyone I've ever been front seat to before. And those are just a few of the stories. But it's interesting, along with her favor, she also fought cancer for 18 months. She also fought a life-threatening diagnosis that could have killed her. Like, she fought that, right? And then you think, even in the midst of all this stuff, that just doesn't seem fair. But what if that was still God showing Tiffany favor? This is the point in the message where I need you to open your mind a little bit and go with me down a direction that it might not make sense and it might seem counterintuitive, because what if even the things that are a fight and the things that are difficult and the things that the diagnosis and the challenges and the pain and the things like that, what if those things are still the favor of God? I think too often we walk through things like that and we throw up our arms and say, why, God? And God's like, just wait. Just walk through it. Just trust me. You'll see it on the other side. Just take the next step and trust me on this. This is where I need you to open your mind and imagine, because sometimes favor doesn't always feel like favor. James said this in James chapter 1. He said, count it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds. Okay, that's just, if you don't know Christ, if you're not a follower of Jesus, You read that and you're like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever read. Pure joy when you face trials, like you have an attitude issue, you're like, because you're angry, you're mad, you're upset, you're feeling the pain of something, right? You feel like you have a right to be angry. And sometimes, humanly speaking, you do. But James says this, count it pure joy. Could trials equal favor? How about this? Jesus said, we're pruned so that we'll produce more. We're pruned so that we become more productive. I think sometimes we think about this idea of more productive, like, dude, I'd love to be more productive. Like, bring on the productivity. But that means pruning. And pruning, if you know what pruning is, it's cutting things off. Not just dead things, alive things. Pruning equals pain, but is it possible that pruning could equal favor? It's counterintuitive, isn't it? How about this? The author of Hebrews tells us this, that God corrects those he loves. Okay, raise your hand if you like to be corrected. Okay, there's 2 of you. Okay. We have counselors that you can tell. No, I'm just. That's awesome. I don't always love to be corrected. I don't always love feeling like I don't know what I'm doing. I don't always love when my issues or my hang-ups or what I'm not good at is exposed and someone says, hey, you're not good at that. Hey, you're doing that wrong. But what if rather than getting frustrated at that person, you're like, hey, that person loves me enough to tell me what I'm doing is wrong. That's correction. Is it possible that correction equals favor? It seems like time and time again in Scripture that the ones that God favored, people that God favored, they received incredible blessing, but not before they endured incredible testing. There was testing before blessing because God had to test them to make sure that he could trust them with what he was about to give them. So here's Joseph. I love Joseph. Joseph is one of my favorite stories in all of Scripture. You think about his life in just a nutshell. He was given a dream as a young man that one day he would rule. Then he was thrown into a pit and sold into slavery by his own brothers. Then he was slandered where he was a slave in Potiphar's house and he was thrown into prison. And then he was forgotten in prison by those who he'd helped. He helped someone, saved their life. That person forgot about them until one day he stood before Pharaoh's throne and the dream that God had given him was about to come true. All of those steps seemed unfair, but God used every step to prepare Joseph for what he had planned for him. What if God is using what seems unfair in your life to prepare you for what he has planned for you? What if what seems unfair to us is actually favor from God upon us? I know it seems strange. I know you're like, this doesn't make sense to me. What if God needs to bring us through a pit and through a slavery in Potiphar's house and in a prison in order to prepare us for what he has for us? In order to prepare us for the palace. Because you see, every single stop that Joseph had along the way, it was a testing. It tested, how much do you believe in the dream? How much do you trust me? Do you believe that I can do what I said I will do? Do you believe that this is available to you because you're my son? Every single step of the way. God tested him in order to be able to trust him, to prepare him for what he had for him. And I know it seems counterintuitive. But even at the end of Joseph's life, he was trying to explain this to his brothers. His brothers saw it one way. He said, guys, I have a different perspective on the matter. And here's what it says. This is Genesis 50:20. He said, you intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people. It's interesting sometimes that favor doesn't seem like favor. Here's another one. The Israelites. These were God's chosen people. Like if you read through Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and you read through the New Testament or the Old Testament, you see that these were God's chosen people. They were chosen by him, God's very own, his prized possession. He opened the Red Sea so they can walk through. He fed them every single morning their daily bread for 40 years in the desert. He walked them across the flooded river, the Jordan River, into the promised land. They were clearly favored, but guess what? They still had to fight. They were favored by God, but they still had to fight. They still had to strap on their swords and their shields. They still had to run out into battle in order to take possession of what God had promised them. They had to work for what God had promised. That doesn't really seem fair, does it? Well, I mean, God promised it, but why can't I just have it? They were favored, but they still had to fight. God didn't promise, here's what we have to understand. God didn't promise that they would never have to work for the promised land. He just promised that his presence would be with them. Listen to this is what God promised Moses. Moses is another one of my favorite verses, Exodus 33:15. Moses said this, he said, if you don't personally go with us, don't make us leave this place. Moses was so wise. He was like, if we're not marked, if the Holy Spirit, if your presence doesn't come with us, don't make us go. Then he goes on. How will anyone know that you look favorably on me and your people, if you don't go with us? For your presence among us sets your people and me apart from all the people on the earth. Then the Lord replied to Moses, I will indeed do what you have asked. Look, for I will look favorably on you, and I know you by name. They were favored, but they still had to fight. But what if it wasn't about the fight? What if the fights that we're in, what if it's not about the fight? What if it's about God's favor? What if the promised land wasn't about the promise, but it was actually about God's presence? It wasn't the land that they lived in that set them apart. It was the one that dwelt among them that set them apart. Let me ask you this. What if God allows the fight so that we can be aware of his favor? What if he does that? Sometimes people say, God, why is this happening? Who knows why it's happening? I mean, God knows, but I mean, I'll be honest, who cares? Because sometimes even if we find out why, then we're like, okay, well, that's the answer. You still have to deal with it, right? You still have to walk through it. You still have to fight the fight. But what if in that moment God allows the fight in order to show you his favor? What if the promise is more about his presence than it is a place? Because it was his presence that showed his overgenerous preferential treatment, his favor towards them. And it's the same for those who follow Christ today. For them, the people of God have always been marked by God's presence. Whether it was Old Testament or New Testament, have always been marked by his presence. Favor seems to be getting something that you don't deserve. When you think about favor, which sounds a lot like grace. Grace is an overgenerous preferential treatment, an act of kindness beyond what is due or usual. You see, when Jesus came, he lived and he died and he defined what grace looked like. He lavishes grace upon us. You see, we deserve death for the sin that we were born into, right? Like we were born into sin, therefore we deserve death. It seems unfair, right? I didn't do anything. I was just born into this mess. Still, it seems unfair. But that's why Jesus came, because it is unfair. So he came. He came to live and die and tip the scales back in our favor. Let me say this. Maybe you don't feel like you deserve God's grace. Maybe you have done something or done things or done multiple things or lived a life as such, you're like, I just don't deserve it. Can I tell you something? You're right. You don't deserve it. Neither do I. None of us deserve it. We've all sinned. We've all fallen short. None of us deserve God's grace. We deserve death. We deserve to die for what we've done, even the very best of us. Yet even at our worst, God determined our worth. So I think sometimes when God's favor is upon us, we really struggle to receive it. And part of the reason why we struggle to receive it is because we don't think we're worthy of it or we're worth it. And as I was thinking about this, I was reminded a couple years ago, I'm sitting in my dining room, which we very rarely sit in, stand in, do anything in besides walk through. It's weird. And so I'm looking out the windows and there's a walking path and it's like spring, right? And I'm looking down where I'm just praying through, because financially the church was in a place like, God, please, we just need your provision. I need you to show up. Like, I need you to be God, to be our provider. And as I was doing that, I looked down, and in the bushes, I saw a dollar bill. And I was like, well, I mean, that's not enough, but I mean, it's a good start, right? And so I went out there, and I pulled it up. I picked it up, and it was interesting because it was kind of crumpled up, and it was kind of like, it was muddy, and it was wet, and it was kind of dirty, and you could tell it was old, and it had been handled like a substantial amount, like one of those dollar bills it's ready to be recycled, you know what I'm saying? And so it was all muddy and tore up, and as I was looking at it, I was like, okay, but it's all tore up, and it doesn't even look like it's worth anything. But then I realized that even a dollar bill that's all tore up and crumpled and muddied and handled and about to be recycled, like, what is it still worth? It's still worth $1. It's not worth $1 based upon what it looks like. It's not based upon $1 because it's, muddied or handled or dirty or crumpled or torn. It's worth $1 based upon the United States government that says that is worth $1, and we'll back that up. It's the same with you and me. Regardless of how handled we are, how crumpled we are, how muddy, how dirty, how used, how tore up, even to the point where we barely look the same, our value does not diminish. Our worth does not diminish from God. Because here's the deal. Our worth is not determined by us. Your worth is not determined by you. It's determined by what someone's willing to pay for you. Jesus looked down from the cross. He's nailed to the cross. He looked down at the people that literally just beat him, just spit upon him, just whipped him, just took a stick and hit a crown of thorns into his skull. He looked down on them, and you know what he thought to himself? They're worth it. They're worth all of this. Every lash, every hit to the head, thorn to the skull, nail to the hand, they're worth it. His death means our life. That doesn't seem fair. And it's not fair. It's favor. It's favor. So here's what I want you to do with this. Just sometimes we get a point, you're like, okay, Jeff, now what do I do? Because that's really heavy. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to imagine that you're worth it. I want you to imagine that you're worth it. Just this week, I was talking to a buddy of mine who God is just lavishing favor upon. And he's having a hard time receiving it. And I just asked him this question. I said, do you not think you're worthy of this? No. Why? If God is lavishing favor upon you, he clearly believes you're worthy to receive it. So why don't you receive it? Imagine that you're worth it. Imagine that you're worth what he did for you. Imagine that you're worth his wrestle in the Garden of Gethsemane. Imagine that you're worth the crown of thorns driven into his skull. Imagine that you're worth the 39 lashes that he received. Imagine that you're worth the nails driven through his hands, driven through his feet. Imagine that your life is worth his death. And I know it's hard to imagine. We can spend our entire life trying to imagine it, trying to earn it, or we can just receive it. Sometimes the greatest limitation to what God wants to do in our lives, or what he's already done in our lives, is simply our lack of imagination. Our lack of imagining that God would do something so extravagant for us. I just told you about Tiffany's shoes and her desk and her office and all this stuff in Disney World. And you're like, oh my goodness, that's amazing. It's hard to imagine that, right? Let's just put that in perspective. That's great. All those things, they're fun. It's favor. It'll pass away. Jesus died on a cross for every single one of us. We get stuck saying, that's not fair. And we miss the favor that Jesus has already lavished upon us. So I want you to imagine that you're worth it. Because you and I are. We're worth it. Not because I said it, because he showed it. He showed it. So here's what I want you to do with this. First of all, every message this month, I've tried to give you a couple steps on how to step into this imagination piece. And here we go. Step one is this. Stop feeling unworthy to receive what Jesus has done for you. Stop feeling that. Stop feeling like you're not worthy of it. Because you are. Because he said you are. Start imagining that you are worth it. Just think about that for a moment, okay? Just everyone close your eyes for a moment. No one's going to do anything crazy to you. I just want you to know, no one's going to come hit you or anything. Just close your eyes for a moment. Imagine just for a moment that you're worth it. That you're worth what he did for you. Even in your sin, even in your mess, even in your worst moment, Jesus still defined your worth by dying for you. I know sometimes it's hard to imagine, but start imagining. Open your mind, open your heart to what he's done for you. And then finally, step 3, you can open your eyes if you'd like. Step 3 is this: step into it. Step into it. Sometimes the greatest limitations is our imagination. Sometimes we don't step into what's right in front of us. We don't take hold of what God has given to us. Don't miss this. Don't miss this. Don't leave his favor unattained, ungrabbed. It's available for us. And all we have to do is step into it. And step into it, when I say all we have to do, step into it, looks a lot like surrender. It looks like a lot like surrendering your life to Christ. Saying, Jesus, I give you my life. It looks a lot like submitting your will to his. Saying, God, I submit my will to your will in living his way. It's because when you live his way, favor is not a byproduct. Favor is the product. Favor is what happens when you begin to live the way God has made us and designed us and wants us to live. So stepping into it looks a lot like surrender. It looks a lot like submitting. Stepping into it, it's a free gift. It's over generous preferential treatment. It's favor, right? It's favor. And living with purpose on this earth and promise for a heaven. Now that's just fun. When you get to live on purpose for a purpose in this life and heaven is before you, guys, there's not much more fun than that. There really isn't. So step into it today. Surrender your life to God today. Grab a hold of what he has, what he's made available for you. Pray with me if you would. Jesus, thank you for today. Thank you for your favor. Thank you for the over-generous, preferential treatment that we did not deserve when you hung on that cross. Thank you that because of your death, we can actually have life. That we can live life to the full, that we can enjoy, we can have fun in the promises and the plans that you have for us, the plans to give us a hope and a future, not to harm us. That's the life you had planned for us. Jesus, help us to step into us. Help us to surrender to you. And really, if you're here today and you're at the point where you've never surrendered your life to Christ, where you've never given your life to Christ, can I just encourage you? Do it today. I don't know what's holding you back. Maybe you've never heard before. Maybe you've never heard a clear presentation before. But can I encourage you? Don't wait. Don't wait to start living the life that God has created for you to live. Don't allow your imagination to be your limitation to what God has for you. Step into it. Say, Jesus, forgive me my sins. Jesus, I surrender my life to you. Jesus, I submit my will to you. Save me. And he will. He will. I encourage you to do that today. Jesus, thank you. I pray that over the next few weeks and months that the words that were spoken in this series would resonate in our hearts and minds. That we would see incredible things, even above and beyond what we can ask or imagine. I pray that, Jesus, I ask that in your name. Amen.